Well, hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Blair Lamb and I make videos about all the different parts of my life. One of my favorite things to do is to make sourdough bread for my family. I have a husband and 2 children, and it is just the best to have fresh sourdough bread for toast in the morning or sandwiches at lunch or with dinner as a side. It's so yummy. And I have been making sourdough for almost a year now and have really come into my own with it. I feel very comfortable making sourdough and have gotten pretty good at it. And the thing that I have realized most about sourdough is that it is not nearly as complicated as it seems from the outside looking in. So my hope with this video is that if you have been hoping to try your hand at sourdough and you've been too intimidated to try it, or you just feel unsure about it, I'm hoping that this video can just break things down and explain the process to you so that you don't feel so stressed out. So come along and let's start with the things that you will need. The first thing that you'll need is a sourdough starter. So sourdough starter is just a mixture of flour and water. And then what happens is the two of those things kind of grab onto the wild yeast that's in our air, which sounds weird, but that's how it works. And then they ferment and they create kind of a bubbly mixture. And so when your starter is active, which is usually after you've fed it more flour and water, that's when it is best to use for baking sourdough bread. When it's not active, it's considered sourdough discard. And so in that case, you can still use it in different kinds of baked goods, pancakes, waffles. I've even seen recipes for things like sourdough brownies. So there's a lot that you can do with this. Now, the ways that you can acquire a sourdough starter, there are 3 different ways. The first one is that you can make it. So I will leave a link below to everything that I mentioned in this video, including how to make your own sourdough starter. I was too intimidated to make my own sourdough starter, so that leads us to option number 2. You can buy a sourdough starter. I bought mine from my friend Gabby, who runs a really cool online shop called the Honey Homemaking Co., and she sells dehydrated sourdough starter. So it came to me in this little packet and I just added water to it, and after a couple of days it was ready. Her starter is about 13 years old. It's a very established and mature starter, and so her dehydrating it and sending it out is fantastic because it's established, you know it's going to work, and I've been using it ever since. And then the third way is if you know someone who also makes sourdough bread, to just ask them if they can give you a little bit of theirs. Because you can always make more if you have an active starter, it's no big deal for someone to give you a little bit of theirs. So those are the 3 ways to acquire a starter, but this is the key. This is the key to sourdough bread. You need a sourdough starter. It's just flour, water, and then wild yeast. So it's very, very inexpensive, and it can be really easy to acquire, especially if you already know someone, a neighbor or a friend locally who could just give you a little bit of theirs. And then sourdough bread is simple. It's just flour, salt, water, and starter. And then thyme is the other ingredient. And so you'll just want those things. So for flour, you can pretty much use anything. It's generally recommended to use unbleached flour. So this is my favorite. This is the King Arthur unbleached all-purpose flour. You can also use bread flour. You can use a mixture of bread flour and this, or you could add in some whole wheat. There's so many different options. And I actually have seen lots of people who have maybe run out of the unbleached and they've used bleached, and it's been fine. So pretty much any flour will work, but this is my preference for baking sourdough. Then you'll need salt. My preference for salt, again, just because it's really high quality, is this. It's called real salt. I buy it in these big bags off of Amazon, and it's amazing. It's delicious and it's so easy. Then you'll also need water. It's recommended to use filtered water, so whatever that looks like in your household, but something that's filtered. You don't want to use tap water. Then you'll want a kitchen scale. Again, this one has been well used and loved for a long time, and it's just from Amazon. It's quite inexpensive and it gets the job done. And then lastly, you'll want a Dutch oven to bake your sourdough in. And this is an Amazon Basics Dutch oven. I absolutely love it. I will link it below if you are interested, or if you already have a Dutch oven, you can grab that. Also, a lot of times the local thrift stores will have Dutch ovens for very inexpensive. I see Dutch ovens there a lot because they have been around for many, many years. Speaking of things that have been around for a while, sourdough has been around for a very long while. So if you've been intimidated, please don't be, because your ancestors likely made sourdough. It's been around for an estimated 10,000 years. In the Encyclopedia of Food Microbiology, Michael Gansel writes that one of the oldest sourdough breads dates from 3700 BCE and was excavated in Switzerland. which 3700 BCE is 5700 years ago. But then even before that, the origin of sourdough fermentation is related to the Fertile Crescent and Egypt several thousand years before that. So we're talking about maybe 8 to 10,000 years people have been making sourdough bread. You can do it. These folks did not have kitchen scales. They didn't have all the fancy equipment. They didn't have all the YouTube videos. They didn't have all of this noise, and they were still making sourdough bread. So I totally believe in you. Let's get to it. Now, over the past 9 to 12 months that I've been making sourdough, I have gotten less and less rule following with it and have just become, it's become more of an art form to me where I go by the feel of things, the look of things. I just have an understanding of what the sourdough is meant to look like at every stage of the process. So instead of constantly measuring and second guessing myself, I just am able to sort of roll with it. So that relates to my starter as well. So I usually just feed my starter equal parts flour and water, maybe about a half a cup to 1 cup of flour and a half a cup to 1 cup of water. Now you'll want to feed your starter about 4 to 12 hours before you want to use it. Some people keep their starter out on the counter and feed it every single day, so it is always at the ready. I bake bread every weekend, so I leave my starter in my refrigerator all week long. I don't feed it. I typically pull it out on Saturday night. I give it a good feeding, leave it on the counter, and then start the sourdough bread process sometime on Sunday morning. So again, it doesn't have to be exact. You're just wanting to have an active, bubbly starter, and that usually takes, like I said, depending on your climate, the time of year, the temperature in your house, about 4 to 12 hours. After you feed it, it will be ready. So I'm gonna go ahead and feed it today, a half a cup of water and a half a cup of flour. Some people like to do this on the kitchen scale and go by grams, and they'll do 50 grams of each or 100 grams of each. You can play around with it if you'd like a higher hydration dough or a lower hydration dough, but if you're a beginner, just about equal parts of both will get the job done. You're just wanting to feed all of that wild yeast so that they'll release the gases, the fermentation will occur, and your starter will be nice and bubbly and ready to bake bread with. Now you want your starter to look like thick pancake batter. It's okay if it has some lumps in it, that's totally fine. If it's a little too runny, if it's runnier than this, you'll probably want to add a little more flour. And if it's too thick that you can't stir it easily, then you want to add a little more water. Again, go by feel, and it should look and feel something like this. I will also link the jars that I used for sourdough, these skinny spatulas, which are fantastic for sourdough, the funnel I use, I'll link all of that below if that would be helpful. Now you want to cover this lightly. So if you have something like this, some kind of lid for your jar, you don't want to tighten it all the way. You just set it on top so there can still get some air in there. And then if you have something, this is my preference. This is called a jar bonnet. This is from that same company, Honey Homemaking Co. But you could also do a DIY version of this with some saran wrap and a rubber band, or a dishcloth and a rubber band. Anything like that. You could even just take a plastic baggie and just set it over the top lightly. Just something where there's a little bit of airflow, but you don't let like dirt or bugs or something like that get into your starter. So I'm going to go ahead and set this on the counter. And again, about 4 to 12 hours. It's currently late July in Texas, so I'm thinking it will be closer to the 4-hour mark today because it's quite warm, but we will see. I'm going to go ahead and mark for you where my sourdough started so we can see you're waiting for it to be about doubled and you want it to be bubbly when you open it up and look into it. So here's where we're starting. I don't typically mark it because I know how to eyeball it by now, but I know a lot of people either mark it or use a rubber band to show where it started so that they can visually see when it has doubled. Okay, she is bubbly and ready to go. You saw in that time lapse how active she got, and she really is double, where we started here. So this is an active, bubbly starter. There's no question in my mind whether this one is ready to bake with. You can very much tell all those little bubbles. It just looks very different than that pancake batter. But the other way that you can tell is by checking if it floats. I am quite sure that this one will float, but we will get to that in a second in case you are unsure of whether or not it is ready. Now we're gonna mix up the dough, and really the first ingredient in sourdough is just thyme, T-I-M-E, thyme, meaning that the ingredients are so simple, it just takes a lot of time, but it's not complicated, you can do it. Okay, so let me move this so you can see it. I'm gonna put my big old sourdough bowl. I love this bowl because it has a grippy bottom. So when you're mixing it on the counter, it doesn't shift around. I really, really like that. I'm gonna get it on there, and then I'm gonna zero this scale out so that it includes the weight of the bowl. And the first thing that I always put in is the water. Now I am using this sourdough bread recipe from Farmhouse on Boone. I printed it out and it has been very well loved. You can see I've used it many, many, many times. And it goes by grams. She also actually does have in the recipe cups. So if you don't have a kitchen scale, you could use this, but I do think that the kitchen scale makes it just a little bit easier. Okay, so starting with water, I am going to do 325 grams of water. Usually on Sundays, I double this recipe. So everything that I'm showing you here, I double, but I'm gonna just do 1 loaf for simplicity's sake. If you're a beginner, just start with 1 loaf and then you can get to the 2 loaves or more later. All right, so let's get 325 grams of water in here. 329, that'll work. And then it's time for our active starter. So we're gonna do 100 grams of starter and you will see that it will float. So I'm gonna zero it out again. And we're gonna, oh yeah, she's floating. 98, can we do a tiny bit more? So now this is still an active starter, but I'm gonna go ahead and put it in my fridge, and then that's when it becomes sourdough discard. So sourdough discard and starter are the same thing at different stages of the process of fermentation. So discard is when it's not actively fermenting like this, and it's not active and bubbly, and then starter is when it looks like this. So I could make more bread with this right now because it's ready to go, but because I'm gonna put it in the fridge and then it'll settle down and it'll become just a little bit at the bottom once all of the air bubbles go down, and then I'll feed it again before I want to use it the next time. Does that make sense? Here you can see the sourdough starter is very much floating. That's how you know it's active. Okay, so before I add in the flour and the salt, I always like to use my Danish whisk to incorporate these two. Okay, now it's time for flour and salt. So let's get this back on the kitchen scale here, zero it out. We're gonna do 475 grams of flour. So we need 475. All right, we're right on the money at 475. There are some people who prefer to mix this up and let this sit on the counter first before adding in the salt. But I do not personally like doing that because I find the salt is harder to disperse, and I have not seen a significant difference between doing it with the salt at this stage or waiting to do the salt. So I'm just gonna go ahead and do it now. So we're gonna zero it out, and then we're gonna do 10 grams of salt, and that's it. So now I'm just gonna go ahead and mix this up. This is where I like to use this Danish whisk. This is one of the very few things that I have purchased for sourdough because it really does do an incredible job of incorporating. So let me get this going here. And this is what your dough will look like at this point. It will be kind of shaggy. It won't have really come together yet. That's because the gluten network has not yet had a chance to form, but we're gonna give it a chance right now. So we're just gonna kind of make sure it's all in one solid unit. And then we're gonna go ahead and just cover it for 30 minutes. And during that 30 minutes, the flour will get hydrated, and so you'll be better able to do the stretch and folds, which I'll show you here in a moment, which build up some tension in the dough so that when you bake it, it pops up and becomes like a real loaf with all that delicious, those little sourdough air bubble pockets and all of that. So I'm just gonna let this sit for 30 minutes. Our dough has been sitting for 30 minutes, so we're gonna get into doing the stretch and folds, which are my favorite part. But first, I just washed my hands really well off camera, and I'm gonna take off my rings because you're gonna get your hands into the dough here, and you want to make sure that it's, you don't your rings aren't getting covered in dough. So a stretch and fold is basically you're just pulling the dough up and then folding it over itself. Again, this is building tension because you're creating layers and layers of like air pockets, and I don't know all the technical terms, but it makes your bread really delicious, and it's also really fun. So what you're going to do is you're going to take your hand in kind of a scooping motion and kind of get it unstuck off the bottom of the bowl as best as you can. Then what you're going to do, and at this point there's still not a great gluten network formed, but you're going to pull it up like this, and you'll see when we're doing later stretch and folds, it will hold a lot better. But you're just pulling it up and pushing it back down, and then see how it's still so craggy? You'll see it won't be like that for too much longer. Okay, then once you've done 4, so you've, like I did it 1 and then turn the bowl, turn the bowl, turn the bowl. Once you've done 4 rotations, that's 1 round of stretch and folds. So we're gonna let this sit again for about 30 minutes before we do our next round. Okay, we are done with those 30 minutes, and now we're gonna do our second round of stretch and folds. You can tell the dough has changed slightly already. So you're gonna do the same thing, kind of release it from that bottom. Can you see how it's falling apart less already? That gluten network is just forming just beautifully. Okay, then we're gonna turn it, do it again. Some people do it the other way from what I'm doing it, so they'll pick it up on this side. It doesn't matter. Some people do another way to do this, but it doesn't matter. Any which way will work. Okay. You can already see how much it's changing. See how much stronger it is now? It's not just falling apart. Okay, and then we're gonna cover it up for another 30 minutes before our last round of stretch and folds. All right, another 30 minutes is done. So let's do our third and final round of stretch and folds. So you see how the dough changes and it's not shaggy anymore, it's becoming smoother and more kind of incorporated. Okay, so here we go. Last round, get it unstuck from the sides. And then we're gonna pull it up. It starts smelling really good, like fresh dough at this stage. If you find that your hands are sticking, you just want to run them under cold water. Warm water will make this like glue, but cold water, which I actually need to do, cold water will really help you. So here we go. 2 more. Look at how strong it is now. Remember at the beginning it was just falling into pieces, and now it's so strong. So you just kind of give it a little wiggle. Because I've done this so many times, I know what it's supposed to look like, and this is exactly what it's supposed to look like. And this will work great. Okay, so now that I have it all folded into itself, and you can even see, like, you see that little air bubble right there? You see that? Shadows in this kitchen. That means that it's just like fermenting and there's bubbles and whatnot. The next step of the process is called bulk fermentation. So you're going to want to put this somewhere warm as you can find it. Pretty much everywhere in our house could be considered warm because, again, it's summer in Texas. And you're going to let it sit anywhere from 6 to 12 hours until it's doubled in size. You could put it somewhere, you know, if you have radiators, or you could even put it next to, if you have a fire going, if it's wintertime, you could turn your oven on. and set it on top of the oven if it's really cold in your house, but you want it to be just a warm spot. So I'm actually gonna, I wouldn't normally do this, but for the purpose of this video, I'm gonna transfer this into a glass bowl so that you can see the time lapse over the next 6 hours or so as it doubles in size. And then I'll show you how we shape it, and then we put it in the fridge for cold fermentation, and then we bake it in the morning. Because there's so many steps, that's why I always make 2 loaves at a time at least. Sometimes I even make more than that. And then I bake them all on the same day, let them cool, and I freeze the ones that we're not using because I don't wanna do just 1 loaf at a time. So keep that in mind as well, that yes, this takes a lot of time, and you may wanna do more than 1 at once. Okay, I put the dough in this glass bowl with saran wrap on top. You do want to cover it so that it doesn't dry out. With saran wrap, you could use a shower cap, you can use a wet dishcloth, anything like that would be perfect. And then you just let it sit until it's doubled in size. All right, we are getting close to midnight. You wouldn't know it because we have a very outdated 90s kitchen and we have fluorescent lighting, so it doesn't look as late as it actually is. But it is about midnight, so the dough has been fermenting for a good long while. Now, before we shape our dough, you always want to sanitize your work surface for obvious reasons because you're gonna put your dough directly on it. So I always give it a good scrub down first. Okay, so here's our dough. I don't think that time lapse was quite as interesting as the starter time lapse, but especially because this bowl is so like wide and shallow, I probably should have picked a smaller, taller bowl so you could see the dough rise up, but it is a lot bigger. Definitely has doubled in size over the past, I don't know, 8 hours or so. So it is time to shape it. Again, you want to go ahead, and if you wear rings, you want to go ahead and take your rings off because you're going to be playing with dough once again. And we're going to set this to the side quickly, and we're going to flour our work surface. So we're going to go ahead and lightly flour it. And then we're going to turn the dough out. Okay, now that we've got the dough turned out, it is a little sticky, and that's okay. You can, at this stage, just let it sit here on the counter for 30 minutes just in the open air. It will help it not be so sticky when you're working with it, but I almost never do that. I just put a little flour on it and move forward. This would be the time if you had made enough dough for 2 or more loaves. Right now is when you would divide it. So I would typically take my little bench cutter thing and I would cut through the middle and I would have 2 separate loaves. But because I only made enough for 1, I'm not doing that now. This is also the time when you would add inclusions. So if you're doing cinnamon raisin, you would add that now, or jalapeno cheddar sourdough, you would add that now. I'm not gonna do any inclusions for the simplicity of this video, but just so you know, that's when you would do it. Just like the stretch and fold, the shaping process, everybody has kind of their unique way of doing it, of what kind of works for them. I like to sort of pull my dough into a rectangle. This dough is beautiful. It's like perfect. And then I fold one end in like that, turn it so you can see it, and then I fold the other end in as well. You really don't want to use too much flour, but this dough was quite sticky, so I used probably more than I needed to. But it just like has the perfect feeling. Then you're just gonna go ahead and roll, and you can see all these beautiful air bubbles. Do you see all these that are coming in the roll? Which is how you're gonna get that beautiful, traditional, classic sourdough texture and crumb on the inside. Okay, so now that it's in this big giant roll, I'm gonna get some of this off to the side. That is beautiful dough, and now we're gonna do my favorite part of the entire process. If you don't have one of these tools, I highly recommend them if you are going to be doing sourdough. This is what I use when I'm splitting my dough up into multiple loaves, and it's really great for scraping it off your counter. And I will also use it in a few minutes to take it off the counter and put it into the bowl for the cold ferment. Okay, so this is what you do. This is kind of a skill that you will just learn by doing. But what you do is you kind of pull the dough, you push it out, and then you kind of pull it back. And this builds tension within the dough so that it will give you a good oven spring, which basically means that it won't be like a low, flat loaf. It will be nice and springy. So you just do it a handful of times. I just love doing this. You can see all the little air bubbles coming to the surface, and it's like the very last step before the cold ferment and then baking in the morning, which is pretty simple. Okay, so now that that is truly, this was a good loaf for this video. This is looking really good. So what you're gonna do is you're gonna take a bowl that's gonna go into your refrigerator. Now I'm gonna go ahead and take my bench scraper and scrape this off. I do usually like to just add a little bit of flour to the top so it doesn't stick to the bottom of the bowl, and then gently put it in there like so. And then what you want to do is pinch. Some people kind of do like a braiding thing or like a little rolling thing. Everyone has their own unique way of doing it, but the beautiful thing is I've tried all different ways. It pretty much turns out no matter what. So once it's in there, so it's face down, so this will be the bottom of your loaf. You're going to take, this is a bowl bonnet that I have wet with water, and then it's just damp now so that it doesn't, the dough doesn't dry out. Saran wrap would work fine too, or a wet dish towel or a shower cap, anything that will just like keep the moisture in. So what I'm going to do is pop this in the fridge overnight for the cold ferment. So you're going to have it in the fridge. I usually go about 12 hours. Sometimes I've gone up to like 24 hours in the fridge. And then I bake it that following day, but I'm gonna bake this tomorrow morning. So it will be about 12 hours in the fridge, and this is the very last step before baking. It's late at night and we have fluorescent lighting, so excuse my looks, but we're gonna go ahead and pop this in the fridge. The ideal amount of time is between 12 and 15 hours, but that is not a hard and fast rule. If it's a little bit less than that or more than that, like I said, I've even gone up to 24 hours, it's fine. So we're gonna just slide it in there, and we'll get to it in the morning. Okay, it's the next morning, and so it's time to bake the bread. The first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and preheat the oven and the Dutch oven. So you're going to want to put that inside to 500 degrees for about 30 minutes. Now that we have our oven preheated as well as the Dutch oven preheated, it's time to do the final step. So this is obviously the dough from last night, so I'm going to set that to the side. You're going to want to use parchment paper or something else. They make like silicone ones that go inside, something to keep the bread from sticking to the bottom of your Dutch oven. My preference is this parchment. It's pre-cut. It just comes in a pack of a bunch of sheets. I get it off Amazon. I will link it below with everything else. It just makes it very quick and easy. I can just grab a sheet and move on. It also is the perfect size for a cookie sheet when I'm baking. So I always crumple it up first because it just sets easier into the Dutch oven that way. Okay, now we're going to get our dough out, and remember you put it in upside down, so you should be able to just pull it out this way and set it right in the middle here. The last step before baking is scoring. So you can be really fancy and do all kinds of beautiful designs, but today I'm just going to show you how to do an expansion score. That's just like a thick, deep one score, because what will happen is as your bread is baking, it will need to release moisture, and if you don't give it a place to release that moisture, it will just choose any place, and then it could just kind of look not how you want it to look. Plus, it's fun to get that classic sourdough ear when it's finished baking. So you're just gonna take your knife. You can also dust this with flour. I'm sure you've seen the amazing designs that people do. This is for beginners, so we're not gonna do all that today, but you're welcome to look that kind of thing up if it would be interesting to you. And you're just gonna choose a place, and you're just gonna do a score that's in like the shape of a C, And I usually go through it one more time just to make sure. Okay, that looks perfect. So we're gonna move over to putting this inside the Dutch oven. This part you need to be very careful because everything is super, super hot. So I'm gonna grab my oven mitts and carefully take the Dutch oven out. And then I'm gonna go ahead and put my sourdough bread in. I just pull it up into fours like this. Carefully lower it in. The lid goes back on and into the oven. Some people put water in the bottom of their Dutch oven. I've never felt that that was needed, but you can try all kinds of things with sourdough. So I'm gonna go ahead and set a timer for 20 minutes. And then at the 20-minute mark, we're gonna lower the temperature and remove the lid. Okay, it's been 20 minutes, so I'm going to carefully reach in and take off the lid. Oh, and it's looking so beautiful. I'll show you it at the halfway point. So beautiful. So now what we're gonna do is put this out of reach because it's very, very hot. And we are gonna lower the temperature to 475. And then we're gonna set a timer for 15 minutes and see where we get with that. Does anyone else's oven like sing you songs for a million years when the food stops cooking? Oh, it's looking gorgeous. Look at her. She is a star. Okay, so you're gonna want a cooling rack of some kind. You're just gonna wanna carefully remove it. Look at that loaf. So pretty. And then you're gonna let it cool. I know you're so excited that you made it and you wanna try to eat it, but it needs to finish cooking while it's out of the oven. So it needs to fully cool. I would say the soonest you would wanna cut it would be like 20 to 30 minutes, but really like an hour or two is gonna be better because sometimes if you cut it too soon, the inside can get gummy and it won't be fully like the fluffy bread. So we're gonna let it sit and we will cut it in a little while and I will show you the results of all of our hard work. It's been a few hours since this came out of the oven. It's nice and cool all the way through. And so I'm gonna go ahead and cut it open so we can see what the inside looks like, which is called the crumb. I have this bread knife and I really recommend it. It's not very expensive. It's just off Amazon. But if you don't have a really good bread knife, you're gonna want one because sourdough bread is hardy. And so you need a really good bread knife. So for the purposes of this video, and also because this is a great way to slice sourdough, which I'll show you in a second, I'm just gonna go ahead and slice it down the middle. Look at that. All of those beautiful air pockets. It's nice and fluffy. So delicious. One of my favorite ways to cut sourdough to serve it is to cut it in half like I just did. And then put one half face down like this. And then you just cut along here little slices. It turns out really well every time. And it's a lot easier than trying to cut a straight slice all the way through. See? So yummy. Now the only thing left to do is to get some butter and put it on here. If you made more loaves than you want to use right now, just go ahead and pop them in the freezer and then just let them thaw on the countertop. And they are so yummy. I hope this video was helpful in learning how to make some yummy sourdough bread. Let me know how it goes for you. I will leave everything linked below. Happy sourdough making. Thanks for watching.